By the late 1980s, Florida had become a hotbed for cocaine trafficking, and Fort Myers Beach was right at the center of it. The state saw some of the highest drug import numbers in the entire country. Turf wars were raging, intimidation was rampant, and murders weren't unusual. One drug dealer in particular refused to bow down anyone, not even law enforcement. With violence escalating, the local authorities had no choice but to reach out to the FBI for help. This supposed dealer had no qualms about derailing any investigation targeting him. As his organization came under the scrutiny of federal agencies, tension soared. Former FBI New York Field Office Chief Jim Carls recalls that the man was feeling cornered, and he was ready to do whatever it took to stay free. To bring him down, the DEA, ATF, and FBI had to pool their resources. On July 18, 1987, a Saturday night in Fort Myers Beach was just like any other, vibrant nightlife on the Gulf Coast, tourists partying, and cocaine flowing at private get-togethers. At one of these house parties, a group of men waited for a friend who had stepped out to buy more drugs. He had been gone for about 30 minutes when, around 10 p.m., gunshots rang out. The man who owned the car the friend had driven spotted it parked in front of the house. Inside was his friend's lifeless body. The Lee County Sheriff's Office got the emergency call, and a crime scene tech arrived to investigate. Only one usable fingerprint was found, belonging to the car's owner. Nearby, 7 shell casings from a .22 caliber firearm were discovered. It was determined that the victim had been shot at close range. An autopsy later revealed 8 bullet wounds to the upper torso and traces of cocaine in his blood. The vehicle owner identified the victim as his 29-year-old friend, Craig. According to Craig's girlfriend, he had gone to purchase cocaine. She urged the police to question his dealer, noting that he had a violent reputation. The dealer, Jeff, was well known to authorities in Lee County. He was a young guy from the area, regarded as a mid-level cocaine dealer. Through questioning Craig's friends, investigators found out that Craig owed Jeff a substantial sum. Word was, if you didn't pay up, Jeff would send someone to handle it. Then, out of the blue, the next day, Jeff himself walked into the Lee County Sheriff's Office. He asked to speak with the detective working the case. He said he wanted to clear his name because he'd heard rumors that he was a suspect. According to Jeff, he was with his girlfriend at a restaurant on the night of the murder. He claimed he only spoke briefly with Craig in the parking lot before going inside. Jeff even provided a receipt from the restaurant and had the waitress confirm the story. Everything seemed too perfectly put together, too rehearsed. The detective had seen a lot of murder suspects over the years and immediately became suspicious of how well prepared Jeff was. With an alibi, witnesses, and receipts, he was instantly placed at the top of the suspect list. A new lead took investigators to a musician who occasionally sold cocaine and admitted to dealing with Craig. This apparently cut into Jeff's business, making him furious. That same night, around 11:45 p.m., Jeff reportedly showed up at the bar where the musician's band was playing and bragged he had just taken care of Craig, as a warning to others in Fort Myers Beach. This story, along with many others over the following months, began to paint a darker picture of Jeff. Still, the rumors and hearsay from the town's underbelly weren't enough to officially tie him to the murder. Without solid eyewitness testimony, the case remained unsolved. Then, in the summer of 1988, nearly a year after Craig's death, a breakthrough occurred. A young woman came forward claiming she had witnessed a murder. She introduced herself to Detective Tom Connews. The woman explained she hadn't spoken up earlier because of her drug addiction and her past relationship with Jeff, whom she had once tried to protect. Now clean and ready to talk, she shared what happened that night. She had been on her way to the same party when she saw the shooting. The gunman, she said, was her ex-boyfriend, someone who worked for Jeff. Unfortunately, the ex was no longer around to question. He had taken his own life months after the murder. The woman didn't just witness the murder. She also had inside knowledge about Jeff's drug operations. According to her, Jeff and his partner were running their business out of a local pizzeria. That's where they handled most of their drug deals, using the restaurant as a front. To avoid detection, Jeff stashed cash and narcotics in various locations, never keeping everything in one place. Very few people actually knew where he lived. She also revealed that Jeff had plenty of people working for him, but she could only identify a handful. Her ex-boyfriend, the one she claimed pulled the trigger, had been one of them. He would do anything for money, no questions asked. As part of her deal with Jeff, she let him use her apartment to store weapons and drugs. In return, he covered her rent. Although her testimony was detailed, the detective couldn't charge Jeff with murder based solely on her claims. There were no other witnesses or physical evidence to back her story. The case still lacked the solid proof needed to move forward. Without the weapon corroborating statements or forensic connections, Jeff remained untouchable. That's when a detective decided to bring in the Lee County Narcotics Division. The goal was to start surveillance on the pizzeria, hoping they could eventually find someone willing to flip on Jeff. The restaurant was busy, which made it tricky. They had to be careful to avoid confusing drug customers with ordinary pizza buyers. Things got even more complicated when Jeff legally changed his name to Jeff Matthews, likely to cover his tracks and distance himself from previous offenses. Over the next few weeks, law enforcement monitored the pizzeria closely. One man in particular stood out. He kept showing up but never bought pizza. A check on his license plate revealed his name was Stephen Franken. Detectives speculated that Franken could be the key to getting closer to Jeff. DEA Special Agent Dennis B., who already knew of Franken, confirmed he was a low-level coke dealer getting a supply from Jeff Matthews. Unfortunately, they still didn't have enough to arrest him. Hoping to change that, the DEA looked for an informant within Franken's circle. They found one. Someone recently arrested for drug possession and one of Franken's best clients. In exchange for a lighter sentence, this informant agreed to participate in a series of controlled buys. If the sting worked, they'd have enough to charge Franken with drug distribution. Once he was in custody, they could try to persuade him to talk about Jeff Matthews. The plan paid off. After several undercover transactions, agents had what they needed. On August 25, 1988, they secured a warrant and arrested Stephen Franken for selling illegal substances. While in custody, Franken's house was searched. Inside, agents found packaged cocaine, digital scales, and a significant amount of cash. Faced with serious charges, Franken agreed to cooperate in exchange for a reduced sentence. He told investigators that Jeff Matthews was a supplier, and that he was willing to say so under oath. Though released on bail while waiting for trial, Franken's cooperation gave authorities their first real connection between Jeff Matthews and the murder case. But just as momentum started to build, things took a dark turn. In nearby Collier County, Florida, a disturbing discovery was made. On October 2, 1988, an environmental inspector came across human remains at a landfill site. The skeleton was fully clothed and had clearly been there for weeks. No ID or wallet was found, but investigators did recover a paper wristband like the ones given out at nightclubs or hospitals. Dental records were pulled for every missing person in the area, in hopes of identifying the body. Eventually, the medical examiner confirmed that the victim was a white male in his mid-20s, shot 5 times in the head with a .38 caliber weapon. The wristband turned out to be from a nightclub in Fort Myers Beach. Cross-referencing missing persons reports, authorities identified the body as 22-year-old Thomas Sellers, who had last been seen leaving the club with a man rumored to be a hitman working for Jeff Matthews. Thomas's father confirmed that his son had a cocaine problem and may have owed Jeff a large sum of money. Once again, the trail led back to Jeff, but just like before, there wasn't enough hard evidence to bring him in. At that point, the only person with direct evidence against Jeff Matthews was Stephen Franken, the small-time dealer who had agreed to testify. Authorities were counting on him to tie Jeff not only to the drug trade, but also to multiple murders. But just 2 days before he was scheduled to appear in court, tragedy struck. It was late at night when a man moving into a new home heard screeching tires outside. In a sudden and violent turn of events, a car plowed through the house and into the backyard. At first, it seemed like a terrible accident, but once detectives arrived, they quickly realized that wasn't the case. Inside the vehicle was a young man who had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. His driver's license identified him as 22-year-old Stephen Franken. Detective Tom Connews was one of the first to arrive at the scene in San Carlos Park. What initially sounded like a bizarre car crash was, in fact, a calculated murder. Stephen hadn't died from the crash. He was already dead from the gunshots when the car hit the house. Based on the trajectory of the bullets, detectives determined that the shooter had fired directly at the driver's side. It appeared someone had set up an improvised roadblock with branches, forcing Stephen to slow down. That's when the gunman struck, likely knowing his routine and the route he would take home from work. In his final moments, Stephen must have slammed on the gas, trying to escape, but it was too late. Crime scene investigators recovered several .22 caliber shell casings near the makeshift roadblock. These matched the same type of ammunition used in the earlier murder cases. They also found footprints and tire tracks, which were cast for comparison later. Franken's murder was a massive blow to the investigation. Not only had they lost their key witness, but it was clear someone, most likely Jeff, had gone to great lengths to silence him. Now, the case took on a whole new level of urgency. Since Franken had been a federal witness, the FBI officially stepped in to take the lead. The DEA, local sheriff's department, and ATF all joined forces. The goal was clear: find Jeff Matthews and shut down his operation before more people died. But Jeff had gone underground. He was careful, secretive, and surrounded himself with loyal people who were too scared to talk. With each passing day, the pressure to stop him increased. Agents decided to try a new angle. They reached out to a man already serving a 10-year sentence for weapons violations, someone who was believed to have once worked as a contract killer for Jeff. To reduce his sentence, the man agreed to talk. He confirmed that shortly before Franken's murder, Jeff had instructed him to track Franken's daily routine: when he left for work, where he went, and how long he stayed. Though the informant had been arrested before the actual killing, his story strongly suggested that the hit was carefully premeditated. The man also told him about another murder linked to Jeff, one that had gone unreported until now. According to him, a handyman had been hired to do late-night tile repairs inside Jeff's pizzeria. While there, Jeff allegedly used the opportunity to test the silencer on his gun, shooting the handyman just to see how quiet the weapon really was. It was a chilling revelation that painted Jeff not just as a drug kingpin, but as a cold, calculating killer. Agents wanted to catch him slipping up, so they convinced the informant to call Jeff from prison. He would pretend to be an old friend and ask for a favor, while the feds recorded the call in hopes Jeff might say something incriminating. The call was arranged. Jeff picked up. The informant asked if he could bring him some music tapes. Jeff said he'd stop by, but he never showed. Jeff was one step ahead. He didn't trust easily and had become increasingly paranoid. Even his closest allies had no idea where he was staying. Some said he lived in one house, others in a different one. He switched vehicles regularly. He was always moving, always hiding. Meanwhile, investigators were certain Jeff was responsible for multiple murders, but they still didn't have the hard evidence to prove it in court. That's when they decided to make a bold move: raid the pizzeria. By early 1990, investigators were reaching their limit. Jeff Matthews had evaded capture for too long, and his violent behavior was only escalating. With mounting pressure, a judge finally granted a warrant to search Jeff's pizzeria, believed to be the headquarters for his drug network. The operation was carefully timed. Officers moved in right after business hours to avoid endangering any innocent customers. Inside, they gathered boxes of documents, phone records, bank statements, and credit card receipts. They also impounded Jeff's car, a black Pontiac Trans Am. Investigators compared the tire tracks to those found at one of the murder scenes, but there was no match. Another dead end. Still, the search wasn't over. The team proceeded to another location, an apartment Jeff was rumored to share with his girlfriend. While the couple wasn't there at the time, investigators uncovered ammunition in various calibers, including .22, .357, and .45. They also found stacks of cash and more phone records. The .22 ammo was particularly important, as 3 of the murder victims had been killed with that caliber. Hopes were high, but when the bullets were tested against the ones retrieved from the murder scenes, the results were disappointing. The metallurgical composition didn't match. Once again, no solid link to the crimes. Despite their frustration, The DEA and FBI believed they had enough to go after Jeff for drug trafficking and running a criminal enterprise. They feared that if he remained free, more people would die. So, based on the evidence gathered, they moved forward with an indictment and a federal arrest warrant. But Jeff had vanished. Friends and associates claimed they hadn't seen him. Even his girlfriend, now also under investigation, pretended to be in the dark. Eventually, though, she agreed to help. In a monitored phone call, she reached out to Jeff on his cell. He wouldn't reveal his location, but during the conversation, he made a chilling statement. He told her that if he found out who had snitched, he'd kill them without hesitation. The call was enough to prove that Jeff was still nearby, and more importantly, it showed he was a direct threat. Soon after, a tip came in from a trusted source. Investigators learned that on the night of Franken's murder, Jeff had rented a car using someone else's credit card. A forensic expert matched the tire tracks from that rental car to those found at the improvised roadblock where Franken had been gunned down. It was the first physical clue tying Jeff Matthews to a murder. But still, it wasn't enough to prove he was the one behind the wheel that night. Investigators had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but what they truly needed was something airtight. Then, just when they thought the situation couldn't escalate further, it did. On March 16, 1990, officers were called to home of a local fire inspector in Fort Myers Beach. Someone had thrown a pipe bomb into his driveway. The explosive had been filled with .38 caliber rounds, and when it detonated, shrapnel and bullets tore into the inspector's car, damaged a storage shed, and even hit the neighboring house. Miraculously, no one was hurt. The inspector was baffled. He had no enemies, no personal disputes. When detectives asked for a list of people who had recently failed fire code inspections, one name stood out: Jeff Matthews. The inspector had recently given Jeff's pizzeria a failing grade. For Detective Tom Connews, the message was loud and clear. Jeff wasn't just targeting rival dealers anymore. He had started attacking public officials. That same night, Connews tried to get some rest. But around 2 a.m., he was jolted awake by a loud explosion outside. At first, he thought it was something minor, maybe a blown transformer or fireworks. Then his phone rang. It was a DEA agent. "Tom," he said, "the building's been bombed." When Detective Tom Connews arrived at the scene in the early hours of March 17, 1990, he was stunned by what he saw. Flames were tearing through the DEA office in Fort Myers Beach. The fire had consumed nearly the entire building, and it was clear this wasn't an accident. This was arson. No, this was war. Authorities immediately suspected Jeff Matthews. After all, this was the same man already wanted for multiple murders and now believed to be behind a bombing at a fire inspector's home. But attacking a federal agency? That was an entirely new level of boldness. This was the first recorded bombing of a DEA office in U.S. history. Firefighters worked for almost an hour to contain the blaze, calling in backup from surrounding departments. By morning, the building was nothing more than a smoldering shell. The damage was later estimated at over $4 million. Luckily, no one had been inside at the time, but the implications were terrifying. FBI Special Agent Dennis B. believed the attack wasn't just meant to send a message. It was likely an attempt to destroy the case files against Jeff. And he almost succeeded. The bomb had landed right inside Agent B's office, which had a direct line of sight from the street. That room contained a filing cabinet with most of the evidence they'd gathered. Miraculously, the cabinet was barely damaged, and the documents inside survived. Investigators started piecing together what had happened. Witnesses had heard a car pull up, a door slam, and then silence, right before the explosion rocked the neighborhood. It was a fast, calculated hit. For law enforcement in the area, the attack changed everything. From that moment on, agents and detectives involved in the case had 24/7 protection. Tom Connews and others were now living under constant guard. For Tom, a father with 2 small kids at home, the fear was personal. Jeff was still out there, and they had no idea when or where he might strike again. FBI forensics teams were called in from Washington, D.C. and Tampa. They began combing through the rubble, collecting every scrap of evidence. What they found confirmed their worst fears. The device had been a pipe bomb. secured between two large gasoline canisters with duct tape. It was built to explode and then ignite everything around it. The construction was crude but effective and terrifyingly dangerous. Determined to track the bomb's origin, agents visited every hardware store and gas station within miles. One crucial detail helped them narrow the search. The bomb had used a pipe with a very specific threading, something not widely available. Eventually, they found the store that had sold it. The clerk remembered the buyer clearly. It was Jeff Matthews. Next, agents asked around at gas stations. One attendant recalled someone who matched Jeff's description filling up 2 large fuel canisters a week before the attack. Piece by piece, the evidence was stacking up, but Jeff, still nowhere to be found. Investigators reached out to his friends, his girlfriend, and former business contacts. Most pretended not to know where he was, but one woman admitted that Jeff had been in touch. He told her not to believe anything she heard in the news, but she didn't buy it. She agreed to let authorities tap her phone. It was their best shot at finally locating him. With Jeff Matthews still on the run, investigators doubled down. They had the woman's phone tapped, hoping Jeff would eventually call. When he finally did, they were ready. The call came from a cell phone, and although he didn't reveal his exact location, the signal pinged a tower near Orlando, Florida. It wasn't precise, but it gave law enforcement a 3-kilometer radius to search. The FBI took to the skies, conducting aerial surveillance while agents were dispatched on the ground. They hoped Jeff would make another call soon, long enough to trace. And he did. On that next call, Jeff was on a payphone. As he talked with his girlfriend, FBI teams scrambled to triangulate the exact location. Ground units rushed to the scene. When they arrived, Jeff was still there, phone in hand. FBI, hands where we can see them. After nearly 3 years of violence, evasion, and terror, Jeff Matthews was finally under arrest. But the story didn't end there. To avoid the death penalty, Jeff agreed to talk. On July 31st, 1990, he requested a meeting with agents from both the DEA and FBI. What he told them stunned everyone in the room. He confessed that he had planted a booby trap van loaded with explosives inside a storage unit in Gainesville, Florida. If anyone had entered it without knowing, dozens of lives could have been lost. The bomb squad was called in immediately. Just as Jeff described, they found a red delivery van inside the unit, rigged with pipe bombs, assault weapons, and tripwires. It was a mobile death trap. Also inside were a silenced .22 caliber pistol, 2 submachine guns, a rifle, disguises, including Halloween masks and fake police uniforms. Detailed instructions for building more bombs. Jeff even told them where to find the body of the handyman he had murdered in his pizzeria. Yes, the one he had supposedly used to test a silencer. The body had been hidden in a freezer and then buried near his old house. Following his directions, agents recovered the freezer and the body exactly where he said it would be. In the end, Jeff Matthews pled guilty to running a violent drug enterprise, multiple murders, and the bombing of a federal building. In 1990, at just 26 years old, he was sentenced to 100 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. The nightmare was finally over. Jeff would never again walk free or terrorize the streets of Fort Myers Beach.